She had baked the cake herself. 3 layers of vanilla sponge, pale yellow and fragrant, stacked carefully on the kitchen counter while the morning light came in thin and cold through the window above the sink. Eleanor had started at 6 in the morning, before anyone else in the house was awake, moving quietly so the noise of the mixer wouldn't disturb the child sleeping down the hall. That child was the reason for everything. That child was the only reason Eleanor was still standing in that kitchen at all. Her name was Rosie. She had just turned 7. And her mother wasn't there. Eleanor Marsh had spent 11 years learning how to make herself small. It hadn't come naturally to her. She had once been someone with opinions, with laughter, with the kind of easy confidence that made strangers feel instantly comfortable. But marriage had a way of sanding a person down if the person they married was determined enough. And Diane Marsh, formerly Diane Calloway, a name she still used whenever it suited her, was nothing if not determined. The guests arrived at 2 in the afternoon, 6 little girls in party dresses, each one clutching a brightly wrapped gift, trailing glitter and noise into the hallway. Rosie stood at the door in a pink tulle skirt Eleanor had ordered online and secretly wrapped 3 weeks ago. Her dark eyes wide and shining, with the particular intensity of a child who has been waiting for something wonderful and finally sees it arriving. "Mama said she'd be here," Rosie said, for the 3rd time that hour. Eleanor crouched down to her daughter's level as she smoothed a curl back from Rosie's forehead with the flat of her thumb and kept her voice very level, the way she always did when she was holding something enormous inside herself. "She might be running a little late, sweetheart. Let's start the games. And she might arrive during." She didn't arrive during. The games were played. The cake was cut. 7 candles were lit and extinguished in a single determined breath. Rosie made a wish that Eleanor would never learn. The mothers of the other 6 little girls smiled the slightly uncomfortable smiles of women who have witnessed something they cannot name but clearly understand, and they collected their children at 4 o'clock with more warmth than usual, the way you become briefly warmer to someone you feel a little sorry for. By 5, the house was quiet. Rosie sat on the sofa with her new stuffed rabbit in her lap and watched cartoons with the sound turned low, already beginning to process her disappointment in the private, wordless way of children who have experienced it before and have learned not to make a scene. Eleanor cleaned the kitchen. She stacked the paper plates. She pressed the leftover cake into plastic wrap with hands that were very steady because they had to be. Diane arrived at 6:30. She came through the front door without knocking. It was still, technically, her house. Wearing sunglasses despite the fading November light and carrying a small shopping bag from an expensive boutique in the city. She smelled of a perfume Eleanor didn't recognize. Her hair had been freshly blown out. "She asleep?" Diane asked, glancing toward the living room, without moving toward it. "She's watching television," Eleanor said. "She waited for you all afternoon." Diane set the boutique bag on the kitchen counter and took her sunglasses off. Her eyes were clear and untroubled. There was no guilt in them. Eleanor had long since stopped being surprised by this, but it still landed somewhere in the center of her chest, like a stone dropped from a height. "I had something come up," Diane said. "It was her birthday." "I know what day it is, Eleanor." "She's 7. She was asking for you by name all afternoon in front of her friends." Diane tilted her chin up slightly, the way she always did when she was about to say something she considered to be a final word. It was a gesture she had inherited from her mother, Margaret Calloway, or she who had been using it to end conversations since approximately 1987. "I am entitled to have my own life," Diane said. "I'm entitled to make my own choices. You don't get to stand there and audit how I spend my time. My life, my choices. Deal with it." Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. Then she turned back to the counter and continued wrapping the leftover cake. She didn't say anything else that night. She put Rosie to bed, read her 2 chapters of a story about a brave little mouse, and sat on the edge of the narrow bed until the small body beside her went fully still and the breathing deepened. She kissed Rosie's forehead in the dark. She went to the bathroom and stood at the sink with the tap running and her palms flat on the cold porcelain, looking at the woman in the mirror. That woman looked tired, but there was something else in her face too. Something that had been building quietly for a long time. Something that tonight, with the echoing absence of a mother at her daughter's birthday party and those 5 words still ringing in the air, had finally moved from ember to flame. Are you watching from somewhere close tonight? Drop your city in the comments. It's always wonderful to know where this community reaches. To understand how Eleanor arrived at that sink on that November evening, you need to go back. Not to the beginning of the marriage, though the beginning contained its own warnings if anyone had been paying attention, but to the beginning of the end, which started, as many endings do, with a death. Eleanor's father, Gerald Marsh, had died 14 months earlier. He had been a quiet man who worked with his hands, a civil engineer who had built roads and bridges in 3 different states over the course of 40 years and retired to a small property in rural Vermont with a vegetable garden and a dog named Arthur. Eleanor had loved him in the uncomplicated, fundamental way you love someone who simply showed up every time, without drama and without condition. She had driven to Vermont alone to be with him in the last weeks. Diane had not come. She had cited a work conference, then a prior social engagement, then simply a general disinclination that she didn't bother to dress up as anything else. Margaret Calloway, Diane's mother, had called the situation morbid and suggested Eleanor was wallowing. Gerald died on a Tuesday morning in September with Eleanor holding his hand and Arthur asleep on the floor beside the bed. At the funeral, a Margaret Calloway wore a cream-coloured blouse that Eleanor had always understood to be the sartorial equivalent of a provocation, and she spent the reception talking to Eleanor's aunts about a renovation she was having done to her kitchen. Diane stood beside her mother for most of it. Diane's brother, Patrick Calloway, arrived late, kissed his mother on the cheek, shook hands with no one else in the room, and made a point of telling Eleanor, in a voice just loud enough for the surrounding cluster of relatives to hear, that the property in Vermont was probably not worth much, given the market up there. It was Patrick who reached for the envelope. It was sitting on the small table near the door of Gerald's house, among the sympathy cards and the visitor book and the order of service. A plain white envelope with Eleanor's name on it in her father's handwriting. Patrick picked it up, looked at it, and made a comment about reading the will before the lawyers got involved, laughing in a way that expected others to laugh with him. Eleanor took the envelope from his hand. She didn't open it there. She put it in the interior pocket of her coat. And for reasons she could not fully articulate at the time, she said nothing about it to Diane. The weeks following the funeral were brutal in their ordinary way. Grief has a texture that people who haven't experienced it don't expect. It isn't operatic most of the time. It's the sight of a phone number in your contacts that you'll never dial again. It's reaching for a piece of advice from someone who no longer exists to give it. And Eleanor moved through these weeks in the way she had learned to move through difficult things. Quietly, efficiently, keeping the parts of herself that were breaking separate from the parts of herself that had to function. She had opened the letter the night after the funeral. She'd sat at the kitchen table in Vermont after everyone had gone, with Arthur at her feet and a cold cup of tea in front of her, and she'd read her father's handwriting. The letter was not long. Gerald Marsh had never been a man for long letters. What it contained was a name, a law firm in Burlington, an instruction to contact them privately without mentioning it to anyone, and a single sentence that Eleanor read 3 times before it fully resolved into meaning. "You were always the one who deserved it, Ellie, and I wanted to make sure they couldn't take it from you." She had sat with that sentence for a long time. Then she had folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, and put the envelope back in the interior pocket of her coat. She had gone to bed. She had not slept. Back in the present, things in the Marsh household continued to deteriorate in ways that were no longer slow or ambiguous. Diane's absences grew more frequent. The boutique bag that had appeared on Rosie's birthday was not the only one. There were weekends away that were explained in the vaguest possible terms. A friend's place, a work thing. You wouldn't know them. There were phone calls taken in other rooms, with the door firmly shut. There was a name that Eleanor heard twice, by accident. In the careful and unguarded way you hear things, when the person speaking them has stopped believing you're paying attention. The name was Marcus. Eleanor knew the name. She had known it for years. Marcus Finley had been Diane's long-term boyfriend before Eleanor, a man of considerable inherited wealth and considerably little else, who had ended the relationship with Diane in a way that Diane had never fully metabolized. His name had surfaced occasionally across the years of their marriage, always in the context of some achievement of his that Diane relayed with an emphasis Eleanor had learned to read precisely. Margaret Calloway had always liked Marcus. She had mentioned this across the years, in the way people mention things they want to be heard without appearing to intend them. Patrick, meanwhile, Jim had been approaching Eleanor about money. He had begun this campaign shortly after Gerald's funeral, framing it initially as casual interest. "Must be nice to get a little something from the estate," he'd said once at dinner, watching her face for a reaction. Eleanor had given him nothing to work with. She was very good by that point at giving people nothing to work with. But Patrick was not subtle. His financial situation, it had emerged over the years through the kind of overheard conversations that furnished themselves without invitation, was precarious. He had a lifestyle that depended heavily on his mother's generosity and on the belief of various associates that he was more successful than he was. He had the confident bearing of a man who has never seriously been tested, and the soft interior of one who knows, on some level, that this is the case. He had begun suggesting, over the preceding weeks, that Eleanor do the right thing and contribute Gerald's estate to a joint family investment he was putting together. He used phrases like family solidarity and what Gerald would have wanted. He said these things with the assurance of someone who has never had to reckon with the possibility that they might be wrong. Eleanor listened. She nodded in the places where nodding was expected. She gave nothing away, because she had, by that point, been to Burlington. She had made the trip on a Thursday in October, telling no one. She had told the daycare she would be late for pickup and driven the 4 hours with the radio off, thinking. The law office of Hendricks and Cole occupied the 3rd floor of a building on Church Street, and the woman who met Eleanor in the reception area was a compact, precise woman in her late 50s named Sandra Cole, who had been Gerald Marsh's attorney for 19 years. Sandra had been expecting her. They had sat for 2.5 hours. Eleanor had driven home in the dark with both hands on the wheel and something vast and quiet rearranging itself inside her. What Sandra Cole had explained, with the patient clarity of someone who has delivered complex news to grieving people many times and understands the importance of not rushing it, was this. Gerald Marsh had, over the course of his working life, been a careful man. Not merely careful in the ordinary sense, prudent with money, attentive to retirement accounts, but careful in a specific and deliberate way that had taken years and professional guidance to construct. How he had first consulted Sandra's firm when Eleanor was 19 years old, the year after Eleanor's mother had died, and Gerald had begun to think seriously about what he would leave behind and for whom. Over the following 2 decades, Gerald had built something. He had done it slowly, without fanfare, in the way that men of his generation sometimes did things of enormous consequence, not because they were secretive by nature, but because they understood that some gifts are only gifts if they cannot be interfered with. The Vermont property that Patrick had dismissed at the funeral as probably not worth much sat on a parcel of land that Gerald had purchased in 2 stages in the late 1990s. What Gerald had not advertised, and what Patrick had no way of knowing, was that a substantial portion of that land had been subject to a quiet negotiation with a regional energy consortium for the better part of 3 years. A negotiation that had concluded 6 weeks before Gerald's death with a signed agreement. Sandra Cole had placed the number on the table between them in the careful, deliberate way of someone who has done this before and knows the importance of letting it sit for a moment before speaking again. $4.3 million, and that was only the land. The other element was the trust. Gerald had established it 15 years prior, structured with the specific intention of being invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it, and legally impenetrable to anyone who wasn't named in it. The sole beneficiary was Eleanor, directly and unconditionally. No joint property clauses, no spousal access provisions, nothing that could be touched in a divorce proceeding, attached in a legal dispute, or diminished by the actions or claims of any third party. Total value, a little under $9 million. Eleanor had sat with that for a while. "Your father was very clear," Sandra had said, after a respectful pause. "He had done his research. He wanted to make sure that whatever happened in your life, this could not be taken from you or used against you. He was quite insistent about the structure." Eleanor thought about the man who had built roads and bridges and retired to a vegetable garden in Vermont. She thought about the way he had said goodbye to her the last time she'd visited, before the last visit, when he was still well enough to walk to the car. He had held her face in his hands for a moment, the way he had done when she was small, and he had looked at her with an expression she had not fully understood at the time. She understood it now. She had asked Sandra one question before she left. How quickly can it be activated? Sandra had smiled, the first smile of the meeting. As quickly as you need. The weeks between Burlington and Rosie's birthday party had been a kind of controlled stillness. Eleanor had moved through them with the outward appearance of nothing changed, and the inward experience of someone who has found, in the dark, a door they didn't know was there, and stood with their hand on the handle long enough to be sure they want to open it. Diane's behavior in those weeks had, if anything, clarified the decision for her. The weekends away continued. The name Marcus surfaced again, once, or in a phone call that Diane took in the garden at 11 o'clock on a Sunday night, not realizing that Eleanor was sitting in the dark of the upstairs bedroom with the window open. The tone of Diane's voice on that call, warm, unguarded, entirely unlike the voice she used in the house, had told Eleanor everything remaining. Margaret called twice. Both times her calls concerned money, once to ask, with elaborate casualness, whether Eleanor had sorted out the estate business yet, and once to mention that Patrick's investment venture was very nearly fully subscribed and that family should support family. Eleanor told her it was all still in the hands of the lawyers, which was true. Patrick stopped by unannounced on a Wednesday and helped himself to coffee and sat at Eleanor's kitchen table for 45 minutes making the case, on with diminishing subtlety that Gerald would have wanted his wealth kept in the family, by which Patrick meant accessible to Patrick. He left without achieving anything and sent a text message that evening that said simply, "Think about it." Eleanor had thought about it. She had called Sandra Cole the following morning. The separation filing was prepared quietly and with extraordinary precision. Sandra had brought in a specialist, a family law partner from another firm, and together they had constructed a legal position that was, in Sandra's words, not merely airtight, but pressurized. Eleanor's personal assets were legally distinct from any marital property. The trust was untouchable. The land sale proceeds had been structured with the same insulating intent. There was nothing for Diane, or for anyone connected to Diane, to claim. But the legal filing was only one part of it. Eleanor had also in those weeks learned certain things. Sandra's firm had conducted the standard financial discovery that preceded a separation filing, and in the course of that discovery, something had surfaced. It had surfaced because Eleanor, for all her outward passivity, had been paying attention for years. She had known which drawer Patrick used when he visited. She had noticed a document left carelessly on the kitchen counter once, 6 months ago, bearing a company name she had written down and looked up afterward. She had mentioned these things to Sandra, and Sandra had mentioned them to her contacts, and her contacts had mentioned them to the appropriate people. Patrick's investment venture, it emerged, was not quite what he had represented it to be. On the word that the relevant financial regulatory authority used in the formal notice of investigation that was issued in mid-November was misrepresentation. The word that Patrick's attorney would later use was considerably less measured. Eleanor had not made this happen. She had simply provided to people whose job it was to look into such things information they had not previously had. That distinction mattered to her. She hadn't built a trap. She had opened a window. The night of Rosie's birthday, lying in the dark of the spare bedroom she had moved into 6 weeks ago, a change Diane had not questioned, another fact Eleanor had filed away. She had sent a single text message to Sandra Cole. It said, "We're ready." Sandra had replied within 3 minutes. "I'll have the documents filed by 9 tomorrow." The first thing to arrive was the letter. It came to the house on a Monday, 8 days after Rosie's birthday, in an envelope bearing the name of Sandra's firm. It was addressed to Diane. Eleanor was in the kitchen when Diane opened it, sitting at the table with her coffee, watching without appearing to watch. She saw the moment Diane read it. The expression that crossed Diane's face moved through several stages. Confusion, then a sharp and focused attention, then something that was very close to fear, though Diane was not a woman who easily permitted fear to show. "What is this?" Diane said, and her voice had that particular quality of someone who knows exactly what it is and is hoping to be told otherwise. "It looks like legal correspondence," Eleanor said. You should probably have your lawyer look at it." Diane looked at her. Something moved behind her eyes, a new assessment, a recalibration. It was the look of someone who has been certain for a long time about the nature of the person in front of them, and who is beginning, with deep reluctance, to wonder if they were wrong. "You're filing for separation," Diane said. "I am." "On what grounds?" Eleanor picked up her coffee cup. "Your lawyer will explain the details." The next 48 hours were loud. Diane called her mother. Margaret called the house twice, both times in a register that was more command than conversation. Patrick sent 3 text messages in rapid succession, the final one containing language that Eleanor took a photograph of and forwarded to Sandra Cole without comment. Diane alternated within the same hour. It's between furious accusation and a syrupy conciliation that she seemed to believe would land differently than it did. Eleanor was very calm. She had not always been calm. She remembered, with crystalline accuracy, the version of herself who had cried in bathrooms and rehearsed conversations that never happened, and spent long nights trying to work out what she had done wrong and how she could do it better. That version felt very far away now, as though she were looking at a photograph of someone she used to know. Sandra's firm had, in anticipation of this window, moved with notable speed. The financial discovery materials had already been prepared. The trust documentation was already in order. A property valuation for the Vermont land had been obtained. Everything was positioned like an orchestra waiting for the conductor to lift the baton. The baton lifted on a Thursday morning. The family law process moved in Eleanor's case with a swiftness that reflected both the quality of her legal preparation and the remarkable simplicity of her asset position. There was no joint property to dispute. There was no shared financial entanglement to unpick. Diane's own financial position, as it emerged in discovery, was notably less stable than it had appeared, a fact that Diane had concealed with the practiced ease of someone who has spent years performing solvency. The house, it turned out, had a second mortgage that Diane had arranged without Eleanor's knowledge. There were credit accounts Eleanor had not known existed. There was a level of debt that, exposed now to the flat light of legal process, looked nothing like the wealthy. To a well-positioned woman, Diane had spent 11 years performing for an audience that included, centrally, Eleanor. Margaret Calloway arrived at the house unannounced on the 4th day. Eleanor opened the door and stood in the doorway. Margaret looked at her from the front step with the expression of a woman who has decided in the car on the way over how this conversation is going to go and is prepared to enforce that decision. She was impeccably dressed, as always. She had the bearing of someone whose judgment has never been seriously challenged and who therefore mistakes certainty for correctness. "I think it's time we had a frank conversation," Margaret said. "I think we've had enough of those," Eleanor said pleasantly. "Diane made a mistake," Margaret said. "People make mistakes. And that's what marriage is for. To work through the hard parts." She missed her daughter's 7th birthday to visit her ex-boyfriend, Eleanor said. "That's not a hard part. That's a choice." Margaret's chin came up. "You are throwing away a marriage because of one afternoon." "I'm ending a marriage because of 11 years, Eleanor said. "One afternoon simply made it clear." "You have nothing," Margaret said, and the warmth in her voice evaporated entirely, like water off a hot surface. "You have no career, no assets of your own, no standing. You've lived in our orbit for 11 years and contributed nothing of financial value. You will walk away with exactly what you deserve, which is very little." Eleanor held the door. "I know you believe that," she said. "I understand why you believe it. But I think you might want to ask Diane to show you the financial disclosure documents before you make any decisions based on that belief." Margaret stared at her. "Good afternoon, Margaret," Eleanor said, and she closed the door. She stood in the hallway for a moment afterward, in the quiet of the house, with her hand still on the doorframe. Her heart was not racing. Her hands were not shaking. She was, she realized with something approaching wonder, completely steady. The call from Margaret to Sandra Cole's firm came the following morning. Then the call from Diane's attorney. Then, with an escalation that Sandra had predicted with impressive accuracy, the call from Patrick's attorney, a different attorney from the one handling Patrick's now escalating regulatory situation, this one specializing in civil matters, he presumably dispatched to explore what, if any, claims could be made against Gerald Marsh's estate. Sandra had dealt with these calls with a composed efficiency that Eleanor found deeply satisfying. There were no claims. The structure Gerald had built was precisely as robust as he had intended. The trust could not be challenged. The land proceeds were Eleanor's, cleanly and entirely. The separation agreement, when it was finalized, reflected a financial reality that bore no resemblance to the one that Margaret Calloway had outlined on the doorstep. An Eleanor who had nothing, walking away with very little. Eleanor walked away with her daughter, her father's bequest, and 11 years of carefully accumulated clarity. Diane walked away with a debt she hadn't disclosed, a house she could no longer afford, and Marcus, who departed the picture with notable swiftness once the financial reality became apparent. It was Patrick's situation that developed with the most dramatic momentum. The regulatory investigation, once opened, had followed the evidence with the implacable efficiency of such things when the evidence is well documented and clearly presented. The misrepresentation finding was followed, in short sequence, by a formal civil complaint from 3 of the venture's investors, then by a referral to the state attorney's office for a criminal assessment, then by the freezing of Patrick's personal accounts pending that assessment. Margaret's reaction to this sequence of events was not something Eleanor witnessed firsthand, but she heard about it through Sandra, through the local news coverage that the story attracted when the attorney's referral became public record, and through a phone call from one of Eleanor's aunts who lived in the same town as the Calloways and could not resist, with considerable glee and minimal guilt, providing a full account. Margaret had initially refused to believe it. Then she had begun making calls on Patrick's behalf, calling in favors from people she had spent decades cultivating, discovering in the process that social capital has a ceiling and a criminal referral is very often it. She had retained an attorney for Patrick at what was reported to be substantial personal cost. She had given an interview to a local newspaper in which she used the phrase politically motivated 3 times, and my son is a good man twice, and which had not, by any objective measure, had helped. Patrick's attorney had entered a not guilty plea. The proceedings were ongoing. The confrontation Eleanor had expected, the one she had rehearsed in some form across the weeks of preparation, came not from Margaret or Patrick, but from Diane. It came on a Saturday afternoon 6 weeks after the separation filing, in the parking lot of the school where Eleanor had just collected Rosie from a birthday party. It was, she would later think, an appropriate location. A birthday party, again, that Diane had known about and had not attended. Diane was sitting in her car when Eleanor and Rosie came out. She got out when she saw them. She looked, for the first time in Eleanor's memory, genuinely diminished. The blowout was not fresh. The sunglasses were absent. There was something in her face that was almost, but not quite, on the expression of a person arriving at honesty. "I need you to tell me why," Diane said. Eleanor looked at her for a moment. Rosie was beside her, small hand in Eleanor's hand, watching her mother with an expression that was too careful for a 7-year-old. "Go wait by the car, sweetheart," Eleanor said. "I'll be right there." She waited until Rosie was out of earshot. Then she turned back to Diane. "You want to know why?" Eleanor said. It wasn't a question. "I want to understand what happened. I want to understand when you became this." "When I became what?" "Someone who just ends things without warning, without discussion, like everything meant nothing." Eleanor held this. She understood in that moment that what Diane was experiencing was not grief for the marriage, but disorientation. The specific bewilderment of someone who has relied for a long time on another person remaining exactly where they have been placed. "You asked me to deal with it," Eleanor said. "On Rosie's birthday. You said, 'My life, my choices, deal with it.'" "So I did." Diane stared at her. "I spent 11 years making myself smaller so that you could feel bigger," Eleanor said. Her voice was even and clear. "I arranged my life around yours. I raised our daughter almost entirely alone while you decided she was optional. I watched you perform a version of our family for other people that had very little relationship to what actually happened in our house. I stayed quiet while your mother told me I had no value. And while your brother tried to take money, my father worked his whole life to protect. I stayed quiet and I waited, and I thought at various points that it would change." She paused. "It didn't change. So I changed instead." Diane's face had gone through several expressions during this. The one that settled was something complicated. Not quite guilt, not quite grief, but some curdled combination of both that was reaching, imperfectly, for regret. "I didn't know about the money," Diane said. And then, perhaps hearing how this sounded, added, I don't mean it like that." "I know," Eleanor said simply. I thought you needed me." "I know that too. And you didn't." Eleanor looked at her quietly. "I could have used a partner. I didn't get one. That's a different kind of need." There was a long pause. A car moved through the parking lot behind them. Rosie, by Eleanor's car, was examining something on the ground with great seriousness. "What happens now?" Diane said, and she sounded, for the first time, genuinely uncertain. "Now the lawyers finish the paperwork," Eleanor said, "and then you'll have a schedule for seeing Rosie, which I hope you'll actually follow this time. And then we'll both have different lives. And the money, the trust, the land, you're keeping all of it." "My father left it to me specifically so that it couldn't be taken," Eleanor said. "I'm going to respect his intentions." Diane nodded slowly. The fight had gone out of her in a way that was both total and, Eleanor felt, permanent. There was no performance left. There was just a woman in a parking lot who had made a long series of choices and had arrived at their consequence. Eleanor turned and walked toward her daughter. "Let's go get some dinner," she said, taking Rosie's hand. "Can we have pancakes?" Rosie said, as she always did, regardless of the time of day. "We can have pancakes," Eleanor said. They drove away. The house Eleanor rented in the spring was smaller than the house she'd left and felt. From the first afternoon, approximately 3 times the size. It had a garden with an apple tree and a room that Rosie immediately appropriated for the express purpose of housing her stuffed rabbit collection, and a kitchen with good light in the mornings where Eleanor made coffee and sat with the quiet for as long as she wanted before the day began. She had made certain decisions about the money that had taken some time and felt, once made, entirely clear. A substantial portion had gone into a trust for Rosie. Not the same structure as Gerald's, but built on the same principles. Insulated, conditional, safe. Eleanor wanted Rosie to have what Eleanor had not known she had. The knowledge, from as early as it could reasonably be given to her, that there was ground beneath her feet that could not be moved. Another portion had gone toward something Gerald would have appreciated and would not have said much about. Eleanor had connected with a community organization in Burlington that worked with single parents navigating legal and financial systems they had not been prepared to navigate. People in positions not unlike the one Eleanor had occupied a year ago, but without a father who had spent 2 decades quietly building them a floor. She had made a 3-year commitment. She attended the first of their community sessions in March and sat in the back row and listened and thought about how differently everything might have looked if someone had explained, early enough, how the structures worked, and who they served. She was still working out the rest. There was time. Diane, in the settling months following the separation, had sold the house to meet the debt she could no longer service. She was renting an apartment near the city with a roommate, a fact that Margaret found apparently difficult to discuss without becoming briefly inarticulate. Marcus had not materialized into anything. Diane was working, genuinely working, for the first time in years, doing a role that required her to be somewhere at a specified time and to produce something measurable. And Eleanor, who harbored no pleasure in this, had noticed that Diane's time with Rosie had become, paradoxically, more consistent and more present since it had become finite and scheduled. People were sometimes different, Eleanor had come to understand, when they could no longer perform a role and simply had to fill one. Margaret had not called since the doorstep conversation. Eleanor did not expect this to last, but found it in the interim restful. Patrick's legal situation remained unresolved, though its trajectory was by now sufficiently established that Eleanor's aunt had stopped calling with updates and had begun simply forwarding news articles. Eleanor read them sometimes. She did not feel satisfaction exactly. She felt the particular quiet thing you feel when a set of facts that you have known for a long time are finally acknowledged by people with the power to do something about them. On a Friday evening in April, Eleanor drove to Burlington and had dinner with Sandra Cole. They sat at a corner table in a restaurant that Sandra had been going to for 20 years and talked for 3 hours about a range of things that had nothing to do with law or money or the Calloway family. Sandra was funny in a dry, precise way that Eleanor appreciated, and she had strong opinions about regional cheese, and she had known Gerald Marsh for 19 years and was willing to talk about him as a person, which Eleanor found, unexpectedly, to be the thing she had needed most. At the end of the evening, walking to their cars, Sandra had paused on the sidewalk. "He would have been very pleased," she said. "I know," Eleanor said. She drove home in the dark with the radio on, through the spring hills of Vermont that her father had driven 1,000 times, toward the small house with the apple tree where Rosie was asleep under the watchful authority of a teenager from 2 doors down who charged a fair rate and had never once been late. She thought about the man who had built roads and bridges, who had said almost nothing important out loud, who had, instead, built her a floor and trusted her to find it. She thought about the sink and the mirror and that November night, and the woman in the mirror who looked tired but had something else in her face that was finally, now, entirely visible. Not anger, not victory. Just the quiet, durable knowledge that she had always been exactly enough. They had simply been the last to know it. There is a kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with noise or performance. It builds in the quiet, in the years of endurance and observation, in the slow accumulation of a person who keeps showing up when it would be easier not to. Eleanor Marsh had been told in 100 ways and by a handful of people that she was not enough, not wealthy enough, not impressive enough, not worth enough to warrant basic courtesy or the presence of a parent at a birthday party. She had endured all of it with a patience that looked from the outside like passivity and was from the inside more like a tide. Tides are patient. They return. And when they do, they change the shape of everything. What would you have done sitting across from that letter in a cold kitchen in Vermont, knowing what Gerald Marsh knew and what he had built and what he had left behind? Let me know in the comments, and if this story moved you, if you've ever had to wait for the floor to appear beneath your feet, please take a moment to like this video. It helps this community reach more people who might need it. This has been another story from this channel. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.